The only sound in the command tent is the dry scratch of a quill against rough parchment. Outside, the wind howls across the Danube, carrying the metallic tang of snow and the distant rhythmic drumming of barbarian shields. The hand holding the pen trembles, not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold of a winter that refuses to end. This hand belongs to Marcus Aurelius, the ruler of the known world, the philosopher who preaches order and reason. But beyond the canvas walls of his shelter, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is burning. In 167 CE, for the first time in 300 years, a foreign enemy has shattered the frontier defenses and set foot on the sacred soil of Italy. The empire is at its zenith, yet it is rotting from the inside out. In the capital, the streets are silent as a plague claims 2,000 lives every single day. Even while on the border, the legions are so depleted that Rome has been forced to arm slaves and gladiators just to hold back the tide. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we enter the frozen hell of the Marcomannic Wars, where the last great emperor fought to save a civilization that was already dying. To the casual observer standing in the Forum Romanum, the empire in the 160s CE appeared to be an unshakable monument of marble and gold. It was the height of the Antonine dynasty, a period Edward Gibbon would famously call the happiest age in human history. But beneath the gilded surface, the foundations were already rotting. In 165 CE, the co-emperor Lucius Verus returned from a victorious campaign against the Parthians in the east. His legions marched in triumph, but they carried an invisible stowaway in their blood. They brought back the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, which exploded across the Mediterranean with apocalyptic fury. Within months, the sweet, sickly thick smoke of incense burned on every street corner, a desperate and futile attempt to purify the air. But it could not mask the stench of the carts rattling over the cobblestones, piled high with corpses. The plague did not discriminate. It tore through the slums of the Subura and the villas of the Palatine alike, claiming the lives of up to 5 million people. In the capital alone, ancient records tell us that 2,000 Romans died every single day. But the true disaster lay in the barracks. The Roman military machine, the iron skeleton that held the world together, was being hollowed out. Garrisons that once housed 6,000 men were now half empty, manned by ghosts and invalids. The tax base collapsed, leaving the treasury empty just when the empire needed gold the most. Rome was essentially an immune-compromised body, weak and feverish, waiting for a single blow to shatter its bones. That blow was gathering force on the northern frontier. For centuries, the Danube River had served as a hard line between civilization and barbarism, a frozen barrier that kept the Germanic tribes at bay. But the geopolitical tectonics of ancient Europe were shifting. Far to the north, the Goths were on the move, driving southward like a slow-moving glacier. They pushed into the lands of the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatian Iazigis. These tribes were squeezed against the Roman border, facing a stark choice: starve, die by Gothic swords, or break through the Roman shield. Although they were not merely looking for plunder, they were looking for survival. The pressure built along the riverbanks for years, visible to any centurion with eyes to see. But while Rome buried its dead and mourned its lost glory, the scouts on the Danube reported a sight that froze their blood. The river was not empty, it was moving, and the ice was beginning to crack. The movement the scouts saw wasn't the shifting of ice, but the glint of iron under a pale winter sun. In 167 CE, the dam finally broke. Balamar, the king of the Marcomanni, achieved what Roman generals had feared for generations. He did not just lead a raid, he forged a coalition. the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatian Ayazyges, tribes that often fought each other, united under a single banner of desperation and opportunity. Tens of thousands of warriors, bringing with them their wives, children, and wagons, surged across the Danube. They crushed the undermanned frontier garrisons like dry twigs and poured into the provinces of Pannonia and Noricum. But they did not stop there. For the first time since the terror of the Cimbrian Teutones, nearly 3 centuries prior, barbarian boots trampled the snow of the Julian Alps. They descended into Italy proper, the sacred heartland of the empire. The citizens of Aquileia, a wealthy and complacent metropolis at the head of the Adriatic, woke not to the sound of market carts, but to a noise that belonged in their grandparents' nightmares: the scream of the Carnix. This boar-headed war horn, with its mournful, terrifying wail, echoed off the marble walls of an Italian city, announcing that the Pax Romana was dead. The smoke from burning villas in the Italian countryside drifted south, carrying a message of absolute terror to the capital. The psychological shock in Rome was cataclysmic. This was not a border skirmish in some misty forest. The enemy was at the gate. The sacred way lay open. The ghosts of Hannibal seemed to rise from the history books. In the Senate, dignity collapsed into hysteria. The priests consulted the Sibylline books, slaughtering oxen and searching their entrails for a reason why the gods had abandoned them. But prayers would not stop Balamar. The legions were broken, the treasury was empty, and the enemy was besieging Aquileia. Panic turned to madness in the streets of Rome, and to fund a counterattack, the emperor was forced to do something that would stain the imperial dignity forever. In the Forum of Trajan, usually the site of glittering victory parades, a different and far more humiliating spectacle unfolded. It was the auction of the empire, a moment of supreme desperation for the Roman state. To fund a war that could not be lost, Marcus Aurelius ordered the imperial palace emptied of its treasures. For 2 months, the citizens of Rome watched in stunned silence as the personal possessions of the emperor were dragged out into the sunlight and sold to the highest bidder. The clatter of heavy golden goblets being thrown onto bronze scales replaced the applause of the Senate. The silk robes of the Empress Faustina, woven in the distant east and dyed with Tyrian purple, were bartered away to merchant speculators. Crystal vases, jeweled daggers, and centuries of accumulated wealth were liquidated for coin. The Philosopher King stripped himself of luxury to save the state, proving that the purple on his robe weighed far less than the iron in his hand. But gold alone does not hold a shield wall. The plague had devoured the manpower of the legions, leaving gaping holes in the ranks that no amount of recruitment could fill. In a move that shocked the conservative aristocracy, Marcus Aurelius did the unthinkable. He enlisted slaves, known as volones, promising them freedom in exchange for service, a desperate measure not seen since the dark days after Cannae. He emptied the jails of bandits and murderers, offering them a pardon if they could kill barbarians instead of citizens. He even turned to the arenas. The gladiator schools, the ludi, were stripped of their fighters. Men trained to die for entertainment, the Murmillo with his heavy helmet and the Retiarius with his net, were handed standard-issue legionary armor. They traded the roar of the Colosseum crowd for the howling winds of the north, and the wooden training sword for the razor-sharp gladius. With this ragtag army of slaves, criminals, and gladiators, Marcus Aurelius and his co-emperor Lucius Verus marched north in 168 CE. They established their headquarters at Carnuntum on the Danube, staring directly into the teeth of the enemy. But misfortune was not done with Rome. On the journey back from the front in early 169 CE, Lucius Verus collapsed and died, struck down by a stroke or perhaps the very plague they were fleeing. Marcus was now alone. The last barrier between the barbarian horde and the annihilation of Rome was a 50-year-old philosopher with no military experience, surrounded by a patchwork army. He turned his horse back toward the dark, freezing forests of Germania, but he did not know that nature itself was about to become his deadliest enemy. This was not war as the Romans knew it. It was a descent into a frozen, green hell. The open plains where a legion could deploy its checkerboard formation, the triplex aces, simply did not exist here. Instead, the campaign dissolved into a brutal grind through the dense, suffocating forests of Pannonia and the treacherous marshes of Dacia. The enemy, the Quadi and the Marcomanni, did not offer battle. They offered only shadows. They knew every ravine, every bog, and every trackless stretch of woodland. For the Roman legionary, encased in 40 pounds of iron lorica segmentata, the environment itself became a lethal weapon. The mud of the Danube basin was not just dirt, it was a sucking, freezing glue that pulled boots from feet and bogged down supply wagons until the mules died of exhaustion in their harnesses. Marcus Aurelius, the student of Stoic philosophy, was forced to become a student of guerrilla warfare. He had to abandon the rigid discipline of the drill manual. The majestic, thunderous clash of shield walls was replaced by the terrifying silence of the forest, broken only by the sudden whistling hiss of a Germanic frame of spear flying from the undergrowth. A column would be marching in the rain, blinded by mist, when the trees would suddenly come alive with screaming warriors. It was a war of nerves. Enough sleepless nights where the snap of a twig could mean a throat slit in the dark. The Romans adapted, lightening their armor and relying more on auxiliary cavalry and German defectors who could track the enemy. But the cost was horrific. By the summer of roughly 172 CE, the grind had pushed the army to its breaking point. In the sweltering heat of a sudden climatic shift, the 12th Legion, Legio Duodecima Fulminata, the Thundering Legion, pushed deep into Quadi territory. They were chasing a phantom army, lured further and further away from their supply lines into a scorched, arid valley surrounded by steep cliffs. It was a classic trap, and the Romans walked right into the jaws of it. The Quadi emerged on the heights, sealing the exit, but they did not attack immediately. They didn't need to. They simply waited, for the Romans had run out of the one thing more precious than gold or iron. The heat shimmering off the rocks of the narrow valley was more lethal than any barbarian spear. Trapped in a cauldron of stone, the 12th Legion was dying, not from wounds, but from the sun. The Quadi warriors jeered from the high ridges, secure in the knowledge that they did not need to shed a drop of blood. They simply had to wait for the Romans to collapse. The legionaries, men who had marched thousands of miles and endured the freezing winters of the Danube, were reduced to huddling under their scuda, their tongues swollen in their mouths and their lips cracked and bleeding. The discipline that defined the Roman army began to fray as delirium set in. Men clawed at the dry earth, desperate for a hint of moisture, while the horses, mad with thirst, had to be put down to save them from suffering. It was the end of the line for the Thundering Legion. Then the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The oppressive heat broke with a crack of thunder that shook the valley floor, followed instantly by a torrential deluge. It was a storm of biblical proportions. The rain fell so hard it hissed against the sun-baked armor of the soldiers. In a frenzy of salvation, discipline vanished for a moment as thousands of men threw their heads back, mouths open to the heavens. They caught the water in their helmets, drinking greedily even as the Quadi, realizing their trap was broken, charged down the slopes. The scene depicted later on, the column of Marcus Aurelius, shows a chaotic mix of hydration and slaughter, and soldiers drank from their shields with one hand, while thrusting their gladi with the other, swallowing a mixture of muddy water and the copper taste of their own blood. To the Romans, this was not weather. It was divine intervention. Lightning bolts struck the quadi positions, igniting their wooden fortifications and sending the superstitious tribesmen into a panic. The Romans, reinvigorated by the sudden drop in temperature and the water in their bellies, fought with the fury of men returned from the grave. They crushed the disorganized attack, turning a massacre into a miraculous victory. In the aftermath, a propaganda war erupted over who had saved the empire. Christian writers later claimed it was the prayers of Christian soldiers in the ranks, while the imperial mint struck coins depicting Mercury. Eo and others credited the Egyptian sorcerer Harnuphis accompanying the emperor. But for Marcus Aurelius, the theological debate mattered less than the strategic reality. The gods had answered. Now, Marcus Aurelius would answer back with a campaign of extermination. The rain had washed away the despair of the 12th Legion, but it was fire that would define the rest of the war. With the miracle of the rain behind him, Marcus Aurelius shifted the strategy from desperate survival to cold industrial annihilation. He realized that simply pushing the tribes back across the Danube was a temporary measure. To secure Rome's future, the threat had to be erased entirely. The Roman war machine began to grind forward with terrifying, methodical precision. The legions did not just seek battles. They sought the food stores, the villages, and the future of the Germanic tribes. Across the Pannonian plains, the sky was constantly stained black with the smoke of burning thatch roofs, and the air carried the heavy cloying scent of ash and rotting livestock. This was the brutal paradox of the Philosopher King, the same man who sat in his tent by candlelight, writing in his meditations about the unity of all living things and the transient nature of existence, spent his days ordering the systematic starvation of thousands. It was a campaign of solitudinum faciant. They make a desert and call it peace. The Marcomanni and Quadi were hunted down in their own forests, their crops torched, and their cattle slaughtered. The treaties Marcus imposed were draconian. The tribes were forced to return over 100,000 Roman captives, vacate a strip of land along the Danube, and provide auxiliary troops to fight for the very empire that was crushing them. By 175 CE, the victory was nearly absolute. Marcus Aurelius was no longer satisfied with a buffer zone. He intended to redraw the map of Europe. He planned to annex the conquered territories, creating two huge new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia. Had he succeeded, the Danube would no longer be the border, and the Roman frontier would have pushed hundreds of miles north to the Carpathian Mountains, potentially changing the entire history of the barbarian migrations. Even the distraction of a rebellion by the general Avidius Cassius in the east could not stop his momentum for long. By 180 CE, the tribes were broken, the new governors were being selected, and the Roman eagle was poised to nest permanently in the heart of Germania. And victory was within grasp, and the map of the world was about to change forever. But then, the emperor's own body failed him. In March of 180 CE, the silence returned to the Danube, but this time it was the silence of a death watch. In the sprawling military camp of Vindobona, near the site of modern Vienna, the emperor lay dying. The plague that he had spent his entire reign fighting had finally breached the flaps of his own tent. The man who had written in his meditations that human life is but a war and a journey in a strange land was reaching the end of his journey. His breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, the sound filling the dimly lit room where his generals stood in grim vigil, their armor dull in the flickering candlelight. They knew what his death meant. It wasn't just the loss of a leader. It was the potential loss of the victory they had bled for in the freezing mud for over a decade. Commodus, his 18-year-old son and heir, stood by the bedside. Marcus Aurelius, weak and feverish, reportedly gave the watchword of the day to the tribune of the guard. "Go to the rising sun, for I am already setting." It was a final command to look to the future, to his son, and implicitly, to finish the conquest. But as the emperor closed his eyes for the last time, the iron discipline of the frontier died with him. Commodus had no interest in the cold, dark forests of Germania. He did not share his father's stoic sense of duty. He craved the warmth of Rome, the roar of the Colosseum, and the easy applause of the mob. Within weeks, the unthinkable happened. Commodus, ignoring the advice of his father's most experienced generals, abandoned the plan to annex Marcomannia and Sarmatia. He negotiated a hasty, shameful peace treaty with the very tribes Marcus had spent a decade crushing. He returned the hostages, abandoned the forward forts, and essentially bought a temporary ceasefire with Roman gold. The legions packed up their tents and marched south, leaving the bones of their comrades behind in a land that remained unconquered. To the soldiers, it was a betrayal. To the Senate, it was a relief to have the expensive war over. But history tells us this single decision was the first nail in Rome's coffin. The Marcomannic Wars were technically a Roman victory. The eagles were recovered, the tribes were chastised, and the frontier was restored. But in the grand sweep of history, they marked the beginning of the end. The peace Commodus bought was an illusion, a temporary patch on a dam that was already groaning under the weight of the water behind it. By abandoning the annexation of Marcomannia and Sarmatia, Rome lost its last chance to shorten its defensive lines and absorb the vigor of the northern peoples on its own terms. Instead, the Danube remained a hardened scar across Europe, a border that would bleed the empire white for the next 3 centuries. The cost of this survival was staggering. The treasury, once overflowing with Trajan's Dacian gold, was empty. The population, ravaged by the Antonine Plague and constant warfare, had shrunk by perhaps 10 to 20%. The legions, the iron fist of Rome, were exhausted and demoralized, their ranks filled with reluctant conscripts and mercenaries whose loyalty was to their paymaster, not the Senate. In the golden age of the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius died in the mud alongside the Philosopher King. What followed was an age of rust and iron. The Marcomannic Wars proved that the empire was no longer the irresistible force of nature it had been under Caesar or Augustus. It was a besieged fortress, fighting not for glory, but for survival. The cracks that appeared here, the economic instability, the reliance on barbarian troops, the weakness of the succession, would widen into the gaping chasms of the crisis of the 3rd century. Marcus Aurelius had held back the darkness for a generation, but he could not stop the sun from setting. The ancient world had passed its zenith, and the long, slow slide into the Middle Ages had begun. If you want to join us as we explore the chaotic centuries that followed and witness the final collapse of the Caesars, please subscribe to our channel to relive these heroic and tragic chapters of history with us.